What happened to Fairy Tail's art style? Fairy Tail has some of the most iconic characters in manga, and it's thanks to Hiro Mashima's art style. But just like his first manga Rave, the art in Fairy Tail changes as well. So having just read all 545 chapters, I'd like to analyze all of the different changes and explain the artistic evolution of Fairy Tail. Now, I do have a few disclaimers. First, as I'm only concerned with the manga, this video will not cover the changes made in the anime. Second, while I will reference it more than once, I will not dedicate a part of this video to the Fairy Tail sequel, 100 Years Quest. And finally, as this will cover the entire manga, this video will probably contain some pretty major spoilers. With those out of the way, let's talk about the first stage of Fairy Tail's art style. The first stage starts with chapter 1, naturally, and ends right around chapter 100. In other words, right before the Battle of Fairy Tail arc. Now, I feel like I should make a bit of a confession. When I first saw early Fairy Tail's art style years ago, I didn't really like it. I don't know why. I think part of it was because of the stark contrast between how it looked back then versus how it looks in the later chapters. But especially after finishing Rave, I kinda like early Fairy Tail's art style better. Not to say it got worse, but there's a certain sense of nostalgia looking back at these chapters. And keep in mind that this took place a year or so after Rave ended, which makes a lot of sense because when you put late Rave next to early Fairy Tail, they look almost identical. But that isn't to say that Mashima didn't make any improvements during that break. In fact, the biggest difference that I noticed was more consistent anatomy. So in the later chapters of Rave, Mashima had really cleaned up his character designs. But you would have random panels where you would see a shoulder or an arm that just didn't look quite right. But in early Fairy Tail, I noticed this never happens. Which stands to show that Mashima was still growing as an artist back then. But for the most part, the art style in the beginning is more or less the same as Rave. Characters have round, circular faces contrasted by long and straight limbs. Like you look at the arms, and while they do have some definition, they almost look like stick arms a lot of the time. On that note, characters are generally composed of very simple shapes. While characters are detailed, the designs at this point are pretty simple, and this is reflected in how they're drawn. So not a ton of detail, and all of the shapes in their designs are somewhat exaggerated. For example, let's take a look at Natsu in this stage. He's got the round face and skinny arms like everyone else. On top of that, his hair looks a lot different than it usually does. Instead of the one spiky bulb of hair we're used to, at this point he has longer hair that's composed of longer, thinner, and more distinguishable spikes. So as you can see, the designs are a bit more exaggerated in this sense. One final note about this stage are the backgrounds. While they are somewhat detailed at times, I found that backgrounds throughout Fairy Tail are pretty simple, and even when they aren't, it's mostly a lot of white empty space. And this is particularly true for the first stage. Not to say it's always the case, as Chapter 1 actually has some nice backgrounds, but those kinds of panels are generally an exception. But on that note, let's move on to the next stage. Stage 2 starts with Chapter 101 and ends right about Chapter 200, or right before Tenro Island. Now, admittedly, there aren't a ton of changes in this stage. If anything, Mashima just tunes up the art style in a couple of ways. The first thing he does is delivers slightly better backgrounds. For example, you have this page where Natsu is looking over the town during the Fairy Tail fight. Whereas before, Mashima would draw some buildings and they would be kind of blank looking. Here it's much better. There's all kinds of different buildings, they're all detailed, there's a focal point and perspective that help distinguish the foreground and background. It's just all around much better than before. It is worth noting that there's still a fair amount of white space. So you look at the buildings and there's still a lot of white. And then you look at the sky and it's mostly empty space. Another example of this is this page here from when Laxus fights Mystagon. Here, Mystagon is using some illusion and Laxus thinks he's being eaten by some weird space monster. I know the monster isn't the background, but it's just worth noting the contrast between tiny little Laxus and the big, very detailed and bizarre looking creature. The perspective in this panel is great and it highlights Mashima's skills in creating depth and proportion. Speaking of skills, Mashima also shows slight improvement in his character designs. One of these improvements comes in the form of anatomy. Whereas before, Mashima removed any blemishes, in this stage he shifts from simple bodies to characters with actual definition. So for example, you have this panel of Laxus where you see just how beefy he is. Not only is he big, but you can see all of the individual pecs, shoulders, ribs. You can even kind of see the muscles in his back. And this definition makes Laxus look even stronger, which is why when we get this panel of Natsu, when he beats Laxus, it makes him look just as strong. You can see the biceps, the boulder shoulder. It's not something that Mashima does all the time, but he starts doing it much more often, and it's a clear improvement from before. Overall, characters are just more detailed in this stage. Not drastically more detailed, but enough so that it's definitely noticeable. And this trend of small changes continues in the next stage. The third stage starts at chapter 201 and ends somewhere in the Grand Magic games. I say somewhere because it kind of blends, but I'd say this third stage lasts right until the point where the Grand Magic games actually start. Now again, there aren't any huge changes in this stage, but as a big Mashima fan, one thing I have to point out is that we start to see panels like this one. So this is a random panel of Loki giving an evil smile. Now it might seem insignificant, but having just started from Rave Chapter 1 all the way to this point, I never saw this kind of facial expression before. And the reason I point this out is because I've seen it more than a few times in Eden Zero. So when I saw it again in Fairy Tail, it occurred to me that this is where Mashima would start to develop his modern style. This is where he starts to develop a certain palette of expressions and skills that he would use again and again. And this panel stands out for the simple fact that it's a bit more nuanced than Mashima's more cartoonish expressions. Instead of just a straight line or a big grin, it's a grin with subtle curves, something that we can also see in this panel of Gildarts. Another staple that makes its debut is in this panel of Hades, specifically how we get this stylized brushstroke aesthetic. This is something that Mashima loves to do, whether it be Fairy Tail, Eden Zero, or even just on his Twitter page. So seeing this for the first time when Hades flexes on everyone is a pretty cool moment. But on that note, let's move on to the next stage. Stage 4 starts somewhere in the Grand Magic games and ends at about chapter 356, or right before Tartaros. And in this stage, there aren't any dramatic changes. However, in my experience, I noticed a few pages where the style of character designs definitely started to shift towards the look of 100 Years Quest. So for example, you'll have pages like this one. So let's take this page and compare it to this panel of Natsu from stage 1. The Natsu from stage 1 is more rounded out, whereas this Natsu seems sharper by comparison. His eyes are almost rectangular with aggressive angles, and his face comes to a very sharp point, whereas before it was almost circular. So by this point in the manga, character designs achieve the more modern look where Mashima favors sharp, pointy shapes over rounded out designs. The only other thing worth noting as far as this stage goes is another improvement in backgrounds. This time backgrounds are much more detailed. So you have this panel of gray in the city, and while there is a fair amount of white, it's not nearly as empty looking as before. You also have this panel where they're celebrating at the castle, and it is loaded with detail, something you would never get in the first stage that serves as a testament to just how much more effort Mashima puts into backgrounds later in the story. And somehow the backgrounds only get better. Which brings us to the next stage. Stage 5 starts with Tartaros and ends right before the final arcs of Fairy Tail. So, chapter 429. Now this stage doesn't revolutionize anything. In fact, it really just continues the trends of the last stage. But the transition is distinguishable enough that the manga looks different from the previous stage. So before we were talking about backgrounds, and they were very detailed for sure, but they didn't look anything like this. This panel strikes you the moment you see it. Not only is it loaded with detail, but the way in which everything is drawn almost seems alien to Fairy Tail. Everything in this page is so dark and heavy, from the satanic looking cross to the cryptic symbols. It all just looks like some kind of black mass, and it immediately gives you this sense of horror. Not only is it detailed, but unlike backgrounds from before, it actually leaves you with this crazy array of emotions rather than just serving as a way to fill up otherwise empty space. Another thing worth noting about this stage is the shading. Mashima is no stranger to shading, but in a manga that uses a lot of white space, it would generally only use it for the more serious scenes. But even then, only sparingly. but in this stage you see it more and more often. In my experience, there was a lot of it in the pages with gray and silver. One last thing I'll mention to sort of transition into the last stage is that at this point we see more and more of what I personally call the Ueda style. So, for those who aren't aware, Mashima does the storyboards for 100 Years quests, but Atsuo Ueda fills them in and does everything else. Now, as far as I know, Ueda was not an assistant to Mashima during Fairy Tail, so I technically can't really attribute this style to him. But it is worth noting because, as you'll notice, it's definitely different from how most people would recognize Mashima's typical art style. On that note, we have the final stage. Stage 6 starts at chapter 429 and follows the final arcs of Fairy Tail. And the only real difference with this stage is what I was talking about before. In this stage, it's pretty much all the Ueda style, as I call it. And I really don't know exactly what is different about the two styles. I think Mashima's more conventional style is more rounded out, whereas the style in this stage is more jagged. So again, characters have a lot of sharp edges, especially the chins. Chins at this point almost look like barbed hooks. A lot of things just make the style look more generic, I guess. So for example, you have this panel of Lucy, and I can't really explain it, but just something about the way her mouth is drawn, it just doesn't look like something from a typical Mashima character. Like, it doesn't look like something you'd see later in Eden Zero. It looks like something from any generic anime. But again, that's just my bro science explanation for it. It's hard to explain, but you just get this feeling. So for example, you take this spread and compare it to this spread. Clearly, the two look pretty different. Part of it is the whole being more generic thing. Part of it kinda seems like line work. But in any event, by this point, we're pretty much at a point where everything looks basically how it would when it's handed off to Ueda. And on that note, that is every change in Fairy Tail's art style. Before I close out the video, I do have a few final thoughts. There is one weakness Mashima has, and this is kind of a hot take. I don't think Mashima is all that great when it comes to how he draws fights. Now don't get me wrong, he can write great fights. But take this panel for example. It's supposed to be a huge clash, but everything looks so tiny and far away, and it lacks any real sense of impact. Contrast this with a panel like this, and it's night and day. So Mashima is very good at sort of clash pages, but in my experience, he's not the best at illustrating the sort of visceral feel of action. On a similar note, he's not really that great at paneling. There's good paneling in Fairy Tail for sure, but it doesn't reach anything like, say, Sakamoto Days or Jujutsu Kaisen. Finally, like I've said before in other videos, I think Mashima is a god when it comes to character designs. I mean, you take any of these characters and even people who don't know Fairy Tail will recognize them. Part of it is because they are somewhat simple, but the other part is because Mashima has a style that is full of personality. I mean, you look at the way he draws other franchises and it always looks amazing. Especially when he did this one drawing for League of Legends. And this is because of his skills and experience in Fairy Tail, where he mastered his art style and created some of the most popular characters in all of manga. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate Fairy Tail's art style? How does it compare to other series? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Jujutsu Kaisen. In that video, I discuss the artistic evolution of Jujutsu Kaisen. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.